So, welcome to The Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
So, Rory, we're getting close into the four figures of questions every week. Where do you want to start?
Okay, so there was a good question, I thought, which I haven't got right in front of me, but it was a question about Macron and Ukraine, which I think caught your attention. And I think the question was, as far as I understand, are we being too soft on Macron? Obviously, you're a fan of Macron, but there's an argument that actually he has misplayed it and that his policy towards Putin has been naive.
I saw that. It was from a guy called Ned Lamb, and it did catch my eye. Am I too soft on Macron? Possibly. Macron didn't have a great week with the elections. Not yet sure whether he's going to get a parliamentary majority. He won the elections in one level. He's going to get the most seats, but whether he gets a majority. And I do think on the whole Jupiter thing, I think when the war started, Macron possibly thought that he could bring his charm and his intellectual firepower to bear with Putin. He could maybe push him more than he has. If you remember, he got quite a lot of grief for constantly having these very long phone calls and so forth. And then he said these things which really annoyed the Ukrainians. He said that, Putin must be humiliated, must be find him a good way out. He then said it should be at least 20 years before the Ukrainians are allowed into the EU. We shouldn't bend the rules, etc., etc., etc. They did say this week that, they want the Ukrainians to win the war. And he's going there. I don't think it's any secret. He's going there this week with Scholz and Mario Draghi. But yeah, I think Putin is definitely trying to play a divide and rule game within the European leadership, and maybe to some extent he's been successful. Also, it's very interesting during these legislative elections, both Mélenchon, the populist leftist, and Le Pen, the populist rightist, they both have kind of hardened up in their support for Putin. It's really been a bit weird to watch. So whether he's reflecting something of that, I just don't know.
It's also, I wonder whether it's actually not a mistake for him to say publicly that Putin needs to emerge with his kind of face or honor intact, that you don't want to humiliate him. That's probably something that you might want to talk about internally. It's an important thing to think about when you're negotiating with someone, but it's probably not something you want to say publicly, that he's almost revealing too much of his thinking and strategy more than he needs to.
There was a great question on Ukraine from Alexander K. We hear a lot about Putin's endgame, but what's the endgame for the West? Are there really any political or only military solutions? And how do we avoid Russia becoming a nuclear ISIS? That's pretty scary.
Pretty scary. And we're in a pretty scary situation, as you know, in Ukraine at the moment. So the Russians are now closing in on Severodonetsk, and they're also closing in on a place called Lysychansk. And in both cases, Lysychansk is a place of about 100,000 people. In both cases, that would make the end, really, for the Ukrainian presence in the Donbass. And the Ukrainian troops are increasingly surrounded. They're running out of ammunition and supplies. And you're really beginning to feel the force of the Russians. I think this is something we've discussed previously, that Russia, for the first 100 days, was such a disaster. There's a temptation to completely underestimate them now. But of course, they do learn lessons. They've had a lot of generals killed. They've had a lot of people killed. They're a very, very big country, and they've got a huge amount of resources behind them. And I'm afraid that's part of the problem here. What is the answer to this? Well, it's going to be very, very difficult to dislodge Russia from those areas once they've taken them.
I thought Putin's latest public pronouncements, he's looked unbelievably smug. He's got that sort of smugness back. He did an event with some young people the other day, and it was the anniversary of Peter the Great's death. And I think we've discussed before that he sees himself in the line of Peter the Great, Stalin, Ivan the Terrible. These are the only leaders that he sort of respects. And he was boasting about his historic role was to take back the lands we lost. And he just looked incredibly smug. He's got that sort of leaning back in the chair, sort of mixing smugness and menacing. It's a deeply unpleasant mix.
And it was a very weird speech, wasn't it? Because he actually even talked about invading Sweden, or at least Peter the Great invading Sweden.
Well, I think he's very troubled by this, the movement in Finland and Sweden on NATO membership and on some of the noises that have come out of there, although his friend Erdogan is trying to help push them back.
And then there's the problem of the United States trying to get, and Europe trying to get on side, still failing to get on side, Gulf states, India, Israel, in really lining up to isolate Putin. And that's, that's worrying, particularly Israel and the Gulf. I mean, the fact that the United States influence in the Middle East seems to wane so much that they can't really get those countries who they've provided so much support for so many years to ally with them on this issue.
There was another question, actually. I can't remember who it was from. It was the whole thing about stopping Ukraine join the European Union, which, I wonder whether that is what is pushed Macron to say it'll be 20 years before they get in, kind of thing.
Well, it definitely was, wasn't it? I mean, I think the answer to that question is that what worried Putin much more than NATO, he was actually bluffing when he said that he was worried about the NATO thing. He didn't think NATO was a threat to Russia. The threat is that if Ukraine joined the European Union, there would be an example right on the Russian border of a prosperous, more democratic, more European state. And that's really what triggered him in 2014.
Yeah. Do you want to pick another question?
Yeah, here we are. So, Johnny Dearden, how can the government balance the benefits of rewilding and conservation with those of keeping land and communities alive with work and affordable housing?
Definitely one for you.
Well, let me try that one. So people will have followed that actually the government's turned back on the commitment that Boris Johnson made to the Conservative environmental movement and indeed to his wife Carrie, which is that he was going to go for a lot of subsidies for more rewilding in Britain. And that has been shelved. And I think one of the reasons for that is something we've talked about in the past, which is that people are beginning to really worry about food security. It's amazing in Britain. We went from, I think, 12 million acres under production down to 9 million acres under production, taking land out for environmental schemes. And the government's drive was to do ever more of that. And I think this question around food security, the fact that we're not beginning to produce enough food to eat, we hover around 50% of the food we eat is actually produced in the United Kingdom, is making them rethink.
We had a little dispute yesterday over Ireland, Northern Ireland, and there's a question here. Which
tiny dispute. Yeah,
tiny. We had a little. I mean, were we a couple, Rory? We'd
I
call
think
it a
there's
spat.
nothing that listeners like more than two middle-aged men shouting at each other. That's
I wasn't shouting. Were you shouting at me? I wasn't shouting. I was very calm.
Instead of me arguing with you, why don't you inform me about something?
Rory, I thought that was just a very agreeable, robust exchange of views rooted in our factual assessments and our passions.
Very good. Well,
okay. Don't be upset, Rory. Don't be upset, please. I don't want to think that I've upset you. That would really, really ruin my day.
Okay, I'm not
it would,
upset.
honestly.
Go on.
Now, when you were in government, did you have anything to do with something called the Treasury Devil?
Yes. Yeah. Go on. Tell us about it.
Well, the Treasury Devil has got to be the weirdest job title on the planet, and it's the name for a senior outside lawyer who is brought in to advise the government on really, really, really tricky stuff. And at the moment, it's a guy called Sir James Eadie, E-A-D-I-E, who's a big QC.
Who I know a little bit. I remember him advising
Do you know
us,
him?
actually. Yeah. He'd come in as an advisor. I sat in meetings where he advised us on stuff back in the day.
Right. So he's the guy who, if the protocol row, not our protocol row, but the protocol row, if it ended up in court, he's the guy who would represent the government, okay? Now, if you wind back, you may remember when this all first became an issue for the government, they said they may have to break international law, quotes, in a limited and specific and limited way. And that led to some pretty senior resignations, Advocate General, the Treasury Solicitor. And the lesson the government took was that if you're going to break the law, as they're now doing, don't be so stupid as to say that you're doing it, okay? So the basic plan is unchanged. They're breaking the law, but they went out and said, we must find a lawyer who's telling us that we're not actually breaking the law. And they found the lawyer. Do you know who it is?
No.
Suella Braverman, the Attorney General. Okay, the one who thinks that Boris Johnson's wonderful. And she invented something called primordial significance, which rests on the idea that the Good Friday Agreement's more important than the protocol, and the UK single market is more important than European single market. And this apparently has the nickname BBS in government legal circles, which stands for Braverman bullshit, okay? It only stands a chance if it's understood there is no official advice to the contrary. So they decided not to ask Sir James Eadie. But then they were told, I'm afraid you're going to have to ask Sir James Eadie because he's been involved in this the whole way through. So they asked him, but they asked him to, quote, assume that the policy is lawful. Okay? That was the instruction he got. So he thought, okay, I assume the policy is lawful. But he wrote his response in such a way that anybody who reads it is absolutely clear that he thinks their approach lacks credibility, isn't lawful, and is not legally solid. So having got the advice they wanted from the utterly political Suella Braverman, they now know there is a paper lying around which would almost certainly get raised in court. And there you would have, acting for the government, the man who is absolutely clear that what the government is doing is not lawful, which is a total mess.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And when James Cleverly, the ill-named James Cleverly, was summoned to the House of Commons to explain this, he hid behind the whole, we never talk about legal advice to the government. But of course, that would be true in a normal functional government where legal advice doesn't leak. But this lot leak like sieves. So it's now out there all around the government and legal circles within government that James Eadie basically thinks this thing is absolute nonsense.
It's amazing, isn't it? And it's all, I saw the leak and it's all couched in this weird civil service language, but he says he finds it more convincing reading the argument that it's breaking international law.
Well, we know what that, if you're a journalist getting hold of that, I think you know what it means, don't you?
Beautiful.
This is Una McGarvey. Which former politician has gone on to do most good in the world? Now, I would argue that both Tony and Gordon have actually done lots of good stuff on, not least through the work they do through policy development stuff. But I think I'm going to pick out Jimmy Carter on that. I think Jimmy Carter has been an extraordinary post-presidential president, and he still sort of keeps going.
Amazing. And I think to some extent Mandela was probably the most dramatic example, wasn't he? I mean, he's somebody that you admire a lot, and we've talked about a lot.
He's dead, though.
He is certainly dead. We're talking about living politicians. Sorry,
Al Gore, I think, has done some amazing stuff on the environment, out of power.
Yep. And it's interesting how they do it in different ways. Gordon Brown, I think, has done it very, very quietly, very responsibly, very, very seriously. And there's been much less the kind of razzmatazz that surrounds, Al Gore or some of the biggest celebrity politicians.
I'm detecting a not really liking Tony in you these days, Rory. I'm sort of just detecting something here.
I'm fascinated by Tony Blair. I'm really fascinated by him. And I'm fascinated by the extent to which he remains so deeply, deeply involved in British politics and the way in which he has still retains an uncanny ability to seize headlines, seize debates, the way in which he'll suddenly take positions that are very, very timely or make a speech.
That's because he's strategic. They're both strategic.
And it is fascinating. But I do sometimes, I tell you what I've never really forgiven him for. I tell you, let's get to the depth of my resentment. I've never really forgiven him for the fact that when Theresa May announced the withdrawal agreement, he was straight out there on that morning and he said, I'm forming an unholy alliance with Boris Johnson to kill this. We both agree that this is the worst of all worlds. Now, he thought that by destroying it, what he'd do is he'd have a second referendum and we could remain in the European Union. But what he actually did is destroy any chance of beating the ERG and Boris. And I thought that was really ill-considered, and I thought it was catastrophic.
Well, do you add me to the unforgiven list? Because
I forgive you because I like and love you and I know you.
Now, talking of former leaders, Chris Murgatroyd, who was your most feared opponent in terms of quick wit? And I'm going to go there for William Hague. Of all the leaders that Tony faced, William Hague was the one who in Parliament, in PMQs, got closest to even beginning to unsettle Tony. And he did it through his extraordinary wit. And the thing is, though, I think I may have told you this before, we disarmed him by developing a line about William Hague that he was all jokes and no judgment. And as a result of that, he stopped doing the jokes and he stopped being witty, and therefore he was weakened. But he was, for me, the most quick-witted opponent. What about you?
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. I think being funny is really important. I mean, look, he's not a kind of necessarily a big name, but I thought, for example, Chris Bryant was very good at being funny at the right moments.
Yeah.
I think humour in Parliament is hugely important. I mean, it was one of the things that sadly went wrong for Keir Starmer in his PMQs. You remember he said, as part of his intervention, "Oh dear," and the Tory backbenchers suddenly caught on that and started saying, oh dear," all the way through his speech. It's incredible how people get unsettled. Hey, here's a question for John Brown, same subject. Is there any value in PMQs? Questions are rarely answered, and it seems like it's more about theatrical performance.
I mean, I think if we start saying there's no value in Prime Minister's questions, we might as well give up on democracy. I think it has become very showbiz. What I used to like about PMQs when I was working with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, I used to see it as a strategic anvil. This is where strategies get hammered out. It's where you really find out whether you've got a strong argument and a line of attack or not. And I'll tell you the other thing it does. I don't think with this government, because I don't think this is a functional government. I don't think Johnson functions as a functional prime minister. But Tony used prime minister's questions as a way of driving the government machine. We would demand things from, I think quite a lot of government departments were terrified of us on Tuesdays and Wednesday mornings because we were demanding facts and detail and data and information and explanations. And we'd be going back saying, this isn't good enough. And so I think that using Prime Minister's questions, not just for the kind of half-hour event that it is, but actually as a strategic anvil and a driver of government, that's where I think it was very important.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, it was the lesson that it took me a long time to learn as a minister. I'd probably been in 7-8 years before I realised that the most powerful thing that you have is using Parliament, using your public statements to take that mandate and use that with government and the civil service, rather than trying to argue every point privately, point by point inside your office, using those public moments to drive it through.
No, I was going to say that the other thing I would say about that is that Prime Minister's questions is the other reason why I think Johnson's sort of lack of contact with the truth is a real problem, because one of the other things that a Prime Minister and a minister can say is, I cannot say that if it's not true. So go and get me the facts. And Tony was absolutely, he would shout every Wednesday morning, I just want the facts. And you get the facts and then you can start to make the political argument.
Okay, let's go for our break. Coming straight back in from the break here, I think a lovely point that you made there about pushing for the facts. I think one of the things that I notice sometimes with civil servants is that people, I'd ask them a question and they'd say, well, I don't think you really want to say that, Minister. So they wouldn't give me the information. And I'd have to push back and say, look, give me the facts and then I'll decide what to say. You can trust me not to say things, but I need to understand what the truth is behind this. I'm not going out there with you having concealed from me the bad news for fear that I might admit it when I'm on the public stage.
There's a great question here from Steve Miles. Yeah. You know, we talked recently about how we were slightly downplayed Wales.
Yeah.
Steve Miles' question, Netflix did an advert for a documentary about a film about the miners' strike, which they said took place in Wales, England. What impressions do you guys get of how Wales and the rest of the UK are seen around the world? Of course, it's not just, I talk to people in Great Britain, British people, who think that Northern Ireland is part of Great Britain, not the United Kingdom. I'll tell you the other thing, even the French are the worst at this. They still talk about l'Angleterre, la reine d'Angleterre, le gouvernement d'Angleterre, as though Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland don't exist. It really, really gets my goat.
We're a complete muddle, aren't we, as a country? And I notice that sometimes some of my colleagues use the word England when they mean Great Britain or when they mean the United Kingdom. We are in a complete muddle. Right. Here's a question for you. Lisa, I'm curious, as a languages teacher in a land of English speakers, what languages do you both speak and how and why did you learn them? Alastair, you're the language man.
I speak fluent French. I used to speak fluent German and I'm trying to get it back. I speak a tiny bit of Dutch and I speak a tiny bit of Gaelic. I learnt Gaelic as a child because my dad taught me, even though we were growing up in Yorkshire. I speak French and German because I loved it at school and I went on to do it at university, and I love speaking French and German. I wish I spoke Chinese and I wish I spoke Arabic, but I don't.
And are you gonna try to pick up another language? Are you gonna deepen your Gaelic or try to pick up a new one?
Well, funny enough, I suggested this idea as a documentary. I'm doing a big TV project at the moment, which I'm not allowed to talk about. But I did suggest this idea a while ago of trying to do a thing where I would go up. I thought BBC Scotland might have jumped at it, where I would try and sort of speed learn Gaelic and see whether I could get up to a reasonable level, because it's such a different language to English. It really is very, very different. But I'd love to learn Arabic, but I don't know whether I'm a bit too old now. What language do you speak?
Well, I speak a lot of languages very, very, very badly, and they're getting worse all the time. It's not like you. I didn't study them properly. I have studied at different times, I think 11 different languages.
Yeah.
And in some of them I can kind of get by, and some of them I'm like, somebody said it's like talking to an Uber driver who's been living in Britain for about 6 months.
What do you speak? Which one do you speak best?
I think my best language was probably Indonesian when I was really concentrating on it.
Right.
And then probably French. Oh, Dari, I was fine chatting. I mean, I think my real strength People like Shoshana, my wife, get really annoyed with me because she is much, much better at the grammar, but she says I'm much better at understanding people. I can understand almost everything that anybody's saying to me.
Do you know the other day I was watching on the day of the French parliamentary elections? I was watching France 24, the English language version, and they had 2 French presenters and 4 French politicians who were all speaking utterly flawless English. And I thought, I can't imagine if we were doing if there was a French version of the BBC, that we would be able to get 4 politicians who could speak fluent French like that.
Am I right that Tony Blair spoke very good French, did he? Is that right?
Pretty good. He did a speech. One of the times I saw Tony Blair absolutely terrified was when he did a speech in French at the National Assembly. I think Tony would accept his French is not quite as good as mine, but it's better than most.
Okay, here's a question from Sharon Mez. How can a green agenda sit next to the rising cost of living?
Go on.
God, blimey, thanks. I think it's a really good challenge. Listen, the answer is that many of these agendas were not happening at a time when there were these kinds of economic pressures. So we have one example which we talked about in yesterday's show, which is the challenge of trying to weigh up land use. You know, how do you balance rewilding against productive agriculture? I think there are real questions faced in Germany for the moment, whether you use coal to generate power more cheaply when people are facing rising fuel prices. And I think, sadly, it is going to put a lot of pressure on many of the expenditures we need to make on climate, because there's always a tension between the short term and the long term, and that becomes much more intense when people are facing inflation at 10%.
The government has clearly diluted to the point of not irrelevance, but substantially diluted the Dimbleby food review. He sounded very dispirited when he was talking about it on the radio the other day.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, Jeff Spink. How will Putin's hunger strategy unfold? Are we going to have to ensure safe passage through the Black Sea with a naval presence and mine-clearing capability? Goodness gracious me.
Well, listen, this is why I think we should be really focused on a longer term thinking about the whole immigration issue. I mean, I've come to the conclusion this is all deliberate, and part of the consequence that he wants is to create famine and to create even greater refugee streams coming our way, coming to the Western Europe. And I really don't think we talked about food security in the context of the UK. What is the global food security strategy? What are the UN doing? What's the World Food Organization doing there? And I'm not saying that as a critical way. I'm just asking that as a question.
No, it's heartbreaking. You've probably been following that Somalia is now in its 4th year of drought and famine. And I remember, I suppose it was 4 years ago, being in hospitals in Somalia and seeing women bringing in babies who were dying, and women who'd lost a child crossing the desert on their way in. And if you're looking for an argument for international development and a reason why I backed the 0.7% and didn't want DFID merged, you really feel it there. And you're going to feel it in Kenya. And very sadly, it's quite possible there's going to be no rain the end of this year either in Somalia. And it's barely funded, as you say.
But it's quite horrible to think that. I mean, even though we've had some really bad people in history and there's some bad people in the world today, but you've got a guy sitting there now who's thought, right, well, I was on the back foot for quite a long time, but I've got away with it. I'm still here. The sanctions aren't really destroying the economy in the way that they thought they might. The world is starting to get a bit bored with Ukraine. I'm fracturing the European alliance. The Americans are still sort of pumping all the weapons, but, I can sit that out. And meanwhile, if I start, messing around with the flow of grain around the world from Russia and Ukraine, I can both, from the Russian side, I can keep the economy going maybe, because, they're also selling a lot of stolen grain. They're selling stolen Ukrainian grain as well. But equally, I can, starve a few people and they'll all, they're going to have to start crossing borders and there'll be more chaos. I mean, it's pretty horrible to think that's what he's actually, that's part of his plan now. It's awful.
And I think, maybe it's a way to conclude, but I think it's a reminder of how very fragile, vulnerable the world system is in ways that we maybe didn't acknowledge 10, 20 years ago, how interdependent we are, and how everything from feeding starving people in Somalia through to keeping our semiconductor chips going depended on a peaceful, relatively peaceful open global trading system.
No, I think we should. I think we shouldn't finish with that. It's a bit downbeat. Can we finish with this one from Paul Heaney? When you two are working overseas, what is your actual job? What kind of organisation is employing you? Well, I can say I'm absolutely self-employed. I travel around the world advising, speaking. I do a lot of my mental health stuff overseas. I'm actually off to Dublin tomorrow for a mixture of speaking and politics. So I'm self-employed, unemployed, call it what you want. What about you, Rory?
So I've actually been mostly working abroad unpaid. I've been very, very lucky, which is that I was receiving a salary from Yale University to teach, and I make some money from this wonderful podcast. And that's allowed me to be able to volunteer for the last couple of years, working with a charity recently in Jordan with Syrian refugees and working with charities in Africa. At some point, if I start doing more of it, I may start being paid.
Good. Well, that would be very well deserved as you continue to spread eau de cologne, English eau de cologne around the world.
Thank you, Alastair, and much love, and sorry about our argument yesterday.
Never apologise, Rory. It was just, it was part. Do I have to keep teaching you to toughen up? You didn't need to apologise. You stood your ground. You expressed your opinion forcibly. You were wrong, but that's your prerogative.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.